charges, as we have learned, were all refuted one by one man, that's St. Robert Bellarmine, and he wrote all of his responses down. And what we have learned is that we have witnessed an absolute magnificent tour de force of the history of the history of the popes, basically, and of how they came to be, and how the office came to be, how it formed, how the traditions formed, how there was separation between the West and the East, how the office arrived at Rome, how the seat remains in Rome, all of it, and all of it proven, demonstrated through the use of the demonstrable historical record, which means we really have not had a theological discussion about this. This has all been based upon whether or not any of the claims made by Calvin and Luther et al. Could be proven or disproven. And as we have learned, the history has proven that Calvin and Luther and Irenaeus and the rest of them were making things up as they went along. We're just hurling charges at the whoever it was that was answering the charges, because it wasn't known to them at the time that it was just St. Robert Bellarmine. And we have learned here that there is quite a body of actual history that remains to this day, in most of it in extant form, some of it in tradition, that backs up the divine case for the office of the Holy Roman Pontiff. And it's been a fascinating conversation. We're just at the end of the book now. And so let's bring on our special guest, our Latinist translator from mediatrixpress.com. It's MEDIATRIX press.com. Ryan Grant, who has been with us for all 16 previous episodes, and we'll wrap up today's with the discussion on Chapter 31. Ryan, welcome to, I guess this is our season finale for this phase of the project. How are you?
Not bad, thank you. And you?
I am well. I'm excited to get to Chapter 31, which is, I believe, where we left off, and to wrap all this up and perhaps recap, and then tie the whole thing together, and then maybe give a preview of the next volume that we'll get into, which will continue the series, called The Antichrist. Although I must ask, because I haven't delved into The Antichrist, because I've been reading this one, will we still go with the title Calvin Was Wrong, or is this a new set of reformers that is the target, or that he is responding to?
It's the same one, and he also incorporates some other Protestants that he had not referenced very much, or really who weren't at all that important in the scheme of things, but made rather impudent or ridiculous arguments. So for the sake, part of it for comic relief, part of it to absolutely demolish the point of the opponent, he'll bring them in. And the focus of the scope of Antichrist, it's mostly Calvin. So I mean, for the sake of the motif, we can focus almost exclusively on where he addresses Calvin, mostly because the only other one worthy of response in this particular area is Irenaeus and Luther.
Right.
So a lot of it deals with Calvin. He has many chapters dealing with Calvin's teaching on this subject. So.
And why don't we recap? Because it's a long way from where we began, way back in October or in early November. Actually, you and I began in September or so, but we had a little bit of a delay, a little bit of a sabbatical, if you will, while things were working themselves out here. So we began this, though, in earnest in the... I believe in December of 2015, and we began with the De Romano Pontifici, book number 1 on the ecclesiastical monarchy of the Roman Pontiff. And the first question that was proposed is, what might be the best system of government? And I think it might be fascinating to just recap, if you would, for just a moment here, that we actually began this conversation about the Pope and about his divinity and about the validity of his office with a discussion first, which is not a theological one, but is a practical one, and one that we may be well to have today. And that's Bellarmine's exploration of what is the best form of government. Why don't you give the listeners a bit of a recap, because it's been a while since we covered that.
Well, certainly. It begins with the question of the ecclesiastical monarchy of the Roman Pontiff. That's what Book 1 is about altogether. So in order to postulate a theological proposition, you have to have a philosophical foundation. And that's why there's that, the explanation for why this is so is, well, look, monarchy is the best system of government. He goes through Aristotle, the ancient philosophers, to explain this. And again, which is mostly refuting John Calvin, because Calvin's philosophy and theology of the church, as explicated in the Institutes, is rather of a decentralized church that has presbyters' councils, priests that they're not priests in an ordained ministerial sense. They're presbyters in the sense of the Greek word presbyteroi, which is elders.
Okay.
And they are the judges of whether or not you are interpreting the word of God. So it is its own little that's being created, but it's, decentralized, and it's just in name only, who's kind of assisting, but it's all done in the presbyters' councils. And so therefore, and the reason for that is aristocracy, according to Calvin, is really the best form of government, not monarchy. And mostly because he's trying to cut off any argument whereby one would arrive at a need for a universal bishop over the church. So Bellarmine refutes that first by showing philosophically why monarchy is in fact the best form of government. And he shows it in two senses. One is objectively, without the conditions of this world, simply an absolute monarchy where one guy's in charge and everyone obeys. That's perfect, because without the circumstances of this world, he would never be a tyrant, he would never be unjust, he would never do anything but order all things rightly. And then, the order and the hierarchy would reflect God and everyone would be happy. But since we do have the circumstances of this world, our fallen human nature and other things, therefore it's necessary that the monarchy, as Bellarmine says, arguing almost purely from Aristotle and the politics at this point,
right,
but also defending it from St. Thomas and from the scholastic philosophers in St. Augustine, is that the monarchy has to be tempered or mixed with aristocracy, elements of aristocracy, and with even democracy at certain levels. And that's essentially what St. Thomas says in De Regno, or De Regimine, I'm sorry, on ruling. He talks at length about this, and so that like a local elective assembly, that is democracy on a small scale, makes sense at that level, but within the stability provided by a monarch, right? So in any event, so Bellarmine prefaces all this to just give the basis that the monarchy is just the way it runs best, right? And even from the ancients, one guy should be in charge of managing all these different things in a state. Well, if that's true in the state, how much more is it in the church, which God established? Would not God establish the best possible system, for the church to run by? And that's what essentially is the preparation is. So after having laid the foundation, now let's move to the church. And it's especially a potent argument in the 16th century because most men at that time, very few, would deny that a king should be over a state, including Calvin. So that becomes, even though Calvin argues aristocracy is the best system of government, and he lives in Switzerland, of course, he would never deny the authority of a prince in his state or things should work a certain way and whatnot. You have, it didn't stop the Protestants from trying to get the Archbishop of Cologne to switch to Lutheranism so as to get a Protestant elector to then establish a Protestant emperor in the Holy Roman Empire. And Calvin was entirely in support of that. So nevertheless, that's why they do it. So now the head of should the church run by a monarchy or by an aristocracy? Well, if God established the church, why wouldn't the church use the best system of government? So then he goes to an exegetical commentary, that means a treatise on the text of Matthew 16:18, as well as other ones such as John 21. Is there a monarchy that Christ established for the church? And then he argues exegetically, based on the Greek, based on so many things, that this is in fact the case. And that it's actually Peter to whom Jesus said, I give thee the keys of the kingdom of heaven, etc. What the keys mean. Right, and you see it even in ancient times. You see it in the Old Testament, and you also see it even in his time,
right,
where you give the key to the city to somebody, right, and that signifies, giving a certain, actually what it really signifies is submission. Okay, and there's like in that time, there's a famous painting of Velázquez, who's the famous painter, is a friend of Peter Paul Rubens. And another two, good Catholic painters. Well, Velázquez had his moral problems, but in terms of his philosophy, he was a very good Catholic painter. He painted the Surrender of Breda, during the 80 Years' War between the Spanish and the Dutch, where the Dutch surrendered Breda. And so Nassau, the Dukes of Nassau, who ran Breda, were handing over the keys to Spagnola, this Italian general fighting for the Spanish. And then Spagnola is receiving the keys. And you can look this up, Surrender of Breda, and you'll see the picture, the painting to see that. So he's handing over the keys to the city to show we are giving the authority over this place to the Spaniards. Right, so that's what that means. That's what the symbol, and it comes from the Old Testament. That's where that symbol comes from. It's not a Roman thing, right? It's simply something that is found in Israel under David. David gave the keys to his prime minister. So then he shows that Peter is the visible head in place of Christ while he's gone. And he doesn't mention it in the book, but it's part of Catholic theology that when the Last Judgment happens, there won't be any more popes in the New Jerusalem. That's it. Christ will resume the visible headship of the church, just as he's the invisible head, and the pope is the visible one.
You know what's the fascinating thing about the key argument is that when you go to buy a new house and you go to closing, and after you've done all the 800 billion signatures on closing documents that you have to sign these days, when you're finished and the document is in, checks are handed over and exchanged and everything, what do they give you? Keys. They give you the keys. When you go to buy a car, if you go to buy a car at a car dealership, Ryan, let's just say you walked in off the street and your friend dropped you off because you knew you were going to buy a car or finance it, pay cash or whatever. When the last piece of the documents are signed and the I's are dotted and the T's are crossed, when they transfer the vehicle to you, what do they transfer it with?
The keys.
Keys. So, the tradition, even to this day, Ryan, is carried forth. So it's obviously a very old tradition that just naturally denotes a changing of or a granting of ownership, a granting of custody. It's just fascinating that people can still deny this today, but they don't deny how they take possession of their houses or their cars.
And then the rest of the book one is taken with what we call in rhetoric in logic, the argument as to the effects. That is, the effects also prove what we have already placed as a foundation.
Right.
So then you have the whole church is signified by the words "my sheep" in John 21, and he also goes in a long commentary in the Greek and how the church fathers have read it. And always in his argumentation, it's copious references to the scripture, and then the church fathers, both the Greek fathers and the Latin fathers, then to the tradition. So that he'll even reach out to the fathers going all the way into the 11th century. So that's like the Benedictine abbot Rupert, or Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, and then, of course, the Venerable Bede, too, who's always a major source amongst the fathers. He's also a doctor of the church, 8th century or so, Saint Bede. So these are, so that's the style of argumentation. So then he continues on to the prerogatives of Peter, and which there's quite a few. And so these are all, shown in the scriptures. So he points out, well, in this case, Peter did this, and in this case, Christ did this for Peter, and all these different symbols that show, he is always the prominent person that's aforementioned. He's the one who has all these special gifts and prerogatives, and then he answers all the objections, both from Calvin and from the aforementioned Illyricus, Matthew Flavowitz, who was a Lutheran. And of course, everyone at that time took up trade names. Even Calvin, his actual name in French is Jean Calvin, and it's Latinized to Calvinus, and that's how we get Calvin. And of course, Luther was his own right name, his Christian name, rather than whatever it was as a monk. So but other guys took these, so it's because Flavowitz is from Dalmatia, which today we call the Balkans. Okay. In classical times, it was called Illyria. He took the name Illyricus. And then there's other figures too. Johannes Musch took the name Oecolampadius. He put it in a Greek form. Another famous Protestant. He had his center of influence at Basel. The Oecolampadius, for example, wrote a terribly dishonest book about the Eucharist, where he had changed what the Church Fathers had said, actually inserted his own words into their quotes, or actually omitted quotes where they clearly taught the Blessed Sacrament. It was John Fisher with a 220,000 word reply that of course, half of that's quoting Oecolampadius, but anyway, demolishing and showing from the clear citations that all people agreed from, and all the editions, that he was just a completely dishonest scholar, at least in that book. Right, because he had a reputation as being a great humanist, but when it came to that book, he completely tried to pull the wool over the eyes of the less learned, and Fisher caught him. It is a brilliant book, actually. Although it can be very tedious for a modern to read, even if you know Latin very well. So anyway, so that's how the book 1 ends. Is
okay.
then objecting, answering all these objections, especially the centurions try to show all these sins that Peter did. So obviously that those were put there to make sure we wouldn't reverence Peter too much, and which is not the case at all. So then it comes to book 2, which we are concluding, which is the successors of the Supreme Pontiff. So he starts out by arguing against a book by Ulrich Valenus, and Valenus had written in the 1520s, trying to argue that, well, it's historically certain that Peter never went to Rome. And so he makes all this argumentation. So then Bellarmine starts and takes each argument apart from the testimony of Scripture primarily, and then also the Church Fathers, to show very clearly that they had been in Rome, and he had been a bishop in Rome, and all the fathers accept that.
Right.
So then, and it demolishes all the different arguments of this Valenus, and then gives this tribute to the holy martyr John Fisher that we just noted last week, where he said, if only I could get my hands on Fisher's book for its most celebrated defense, right? Because Fisher, even then, was one of the most famous theologians in Christendom, and especially because of his staunch defense of the Church and losing his head for it under Henry VIII. So nevertheless, then he proceeds to more evidence that the Pope succeeds, that the Roman Pontiff succeeds Peter in this ecclesiastical monarchy that he demonstrated in Book 1, which comes from the testimony of the Greek and Latin fathers, from archaeology. The tombs of the apostles are here in their reverence, and all these fathers mention them, from the list, the diptych the Church Fathers kept in the ancient church, because that's how you show that your church was an apostolic church.
Okay.
That had the right to rule from Christ and the apostles, and it's set out from its founding bishop who either was an apostle or was constituted by an apostle. And so all the churches, and that's how we have apostolic succession. So all these churches could trace themselves back to, essentially to the Roman Pontiff. When you get down to it, Bellarmine's argumentation is correct that Peter alone was made a bishop by Christ, and then Peter made all the other apostles bishops. So, however that worked, Rome is clearly listed by Irenaeus and by all these fathers as having, it's beginning with Peter, and then the popes going down as they're named in the Roman canon, and then finally, from law, that you only see that from the Pope, there's no appeal. And but not from any other bishop, and that the laws, the Pope always has the right to dispense the laws, but he respects the rights given to the other patriarchs and to the other areas of the church, so that he's not trying to, because it'd be impossible to bureaucratically manage every last darn thing going on in the church all around the world, especially in those times when everything's going by boat, and depending on the wind, if it's the wrong time of year, it might take you a very long time to get around.
A very long time, I would imagine.
Quite a bit. And then even mail service at different points, especially in the early papacy, depending on what was going on in the empire. Letter service, especially during the period of persecution, you might really have a great difficulty getting around. So then, as things continue, that the popes very clearly write letters, are expected to be obeyed. Councils address the popes. They say, Peter has spoken through Leo, that is Pope Leo the Great. The Council of Chalcedon says that, and they're acknowledging Leo as the successor of Peter. And the same thing for in the later council, Pope Agatho. They say Peter has spoken through Agatho. So all of these things come together, and then lastly, then we hit this question of what could happen if the Pope became a manifest heretic. Would he lose his office? And as we addressed that very copiously last time, what that actually means, what goes on if what has to happen if the Pope would become a manifest heretic. So it takes on all these different arguments, and
we
including one of
learn,
which.
yeah,
Oh, sorry.
I was going to say we learn in that he can't be a heretic because by definition, then he wouldn't be a pope because he wouldn't even be a Catholic. So I was
Right.
just going to insert just because of today's date that today, Ryan, in your translation of the work, I don't know if you ever counted or have an estimate, but we did run across the name Saint Irenaeus many times. That today is his feast day.
That's right. Irenaeus is a Greek father. Is taken as because he originally wrote in Greek, and he lived in Lyon in France. At that time, the Roman name for it is Lutenenses, and he had written a work against heresies. We're mostly writing against the Gnostic heresy. And he's about 180 AD,
right,
or so, and he writes in there in Book 3 that it is necessary for all churches to agree with the Roman Church, this one church, on account of a mightier preeminence that it has over all the rest. So that's 180 AD. So that's before
right.
The whole Constantine thesis. Sorry,
That's right.
And it's not just because the so-called all roads lead to Rome, especially in the East. It's really because that's where Peter had established the primacy. Because the reason all roads lead to Rome is so the Romans can more quickly exact tax money coming out of people. But it was not necessarily easier to get, if you were a private person, to send messages to Rome or get to Rome. And in actuality, especially in the East, it was a lot easier to communicate in the East. So that's why Pope Clement I, in about 80 AD, the Corinthians write to him.
That's right.
Asking for guidance, whereas in John the Apostle is alive in Ephesus, right? Who the heck is Clement? He's a freed slave that was Peter's secretary. But John the Apostle was there at the crucifixion. He's the apostle that reclined with Christ at the Last Supper. Don't you think that he would know a lot more than this Greek freed slave Clement about who Jesus was? But they write anyway.
And not only that, Ryan, but
rather than Ephesus, which is much closer, much easier to write to, because it was also the Roman imperial center for Asia Minor, what we now call Turkey.
And I was going to say, I was just going to add, not only that, but Saint Irenaeus was a student of, a disciple, if you will, of Saint Polycarp. Saint Polycarp is one of my favorite saints because the biography written about him by Alban Butler, and I've read it many times. What a story that is. And St. Polycarp was a disciple of the aforementioned St. John the Evangelist. So you have a very, very clear chain of right there of St. John the Evangelist or the Apostle to St. Polycarp and then to St. Irenaeus. And St. Irenaeus, as I said, is mentioned many times in our work. And that brings us, I think that's a really good recap, and that brings us to the 25-minute mark. Why don't we take our time out by setting up what we're going to discuss in the next segment here, and we'll conclude Volume 2, which is that the Roman Pontiff succeeds Peter in the ecclesiastical monarchy is proven for the names which Roman pontiffs are usually given. And this is a fascinating chapter. I read it this morning, and I can't wait to hear your take on this, and I'm sure the audience can't either. So why don't we do that, and then we'll talk about getting into the next phase of our project here, which will be into the Antichrist book. Folks, this is the Modern Wrong World Made Right. Calvin Was Wrong, episode number 17. We are here live. This is the Crusade channel, and part of the Veritas Radio Network, Radio the Way It Should Be. All right, we'll pick up on our final segment here, our final episode, if you will, on Volume 1 and Volume 2 on the controversy, translated by Ryan Grant from the Latin of St. Robert Bellarmine. And we'll pick up with Chapter 31, that the Roman Pontiff succeeds, and this is the final chapter, that the Roman Pontiff succeeds Peter, and the ecclesiastical monarchy is proven from the names which Roman pontiffs are usually given. This is a part of the history of the papacy that is a very inconvenient truth to those that deny its divinity and deny its validity. I'll let Ryan Grant take it from here. Ryan?
The very last argument that he gives is taken from the 15 names that are customarily given to the Roman pontiff by the church. And so these are taken from councils. These are taken from not just church councils, but church fathers, letters, and other places where you find the reference. And so these 15 are Pope, Father of Fathers, Pontiff of Christians, High Priest, Prince of Priests, Vicar of Christ, Head of the body of the church, Foundation of the building of the church, Shepherd of the sheepfold of the Lord, Father and Doctor of all the faithful. Doctor meaning teacher, by the way, not as in medicus, a medical doctor. Ruler of the house of God, Watchman of the vineyard of God, Spouse of the church, Prelate of the apostolic see, and universal bishop. His primacy is obviously gathered from each individual one. So then he begins it. The first and most common, as well as the most ancient name of the Bishop of Rome is Pope. In the Latin, that's Papa. Papa, which is, of course, in Spanish and Italian, it's also the same word for potato. So if you use la papa in both Spanish and Italian, it comes out to the potato. And then if it's il papa in Italian, I'm pretty sure that's el papa in Spanish, then it's the Pope. So just a little note there. But in Latin, it's just one word, papa, which is masculine. And so St. Ignatius of Antioch, not Loyola, in his epistle to Mary the proselyte near Zarbus writes, "Since you are at Rome with Pope Linus," etc. Moreover, Pope, or Papas, as it is in Greek, is a name which charming or babbling children usually call their fathers, as it appears in Philemon, the comic writer quoted in the Athenaeum, "Chaire papa philate," and in the Odyssey of Homer, where a daughter says to her father, "Papa phile," which is, beloved father. And among the Latin writers, likewise, this is given in classical Roman drama and whatnot. They use that term papa from the Greek or papas. Incidentally, there is one other bishop that historically had the title of papos, and that's and still has it actually, and that's the Patriarch of Alexandria, the head of the Coptic Church. And traditionally, the patriarchs of Alexandria also had that term papos. And there again, too, there's also, but it's the connection with Peter, because St. Mark was sent to Alexandria by St. Peter.
Okay.
And so historically, that's some of the connection. So in the early, church, the word pope in and of itself just means father. And since he was the second after Rome, he was also a father, almost like a father of the East, just not the universal father, as we'll see. So even today, the Patriarch of Alexandria of the Coptic Church is called the Pope of Coptics or something like that. So anyway, the name was given by the fathers now and then to a bishop. For Jerome, in all his epistles to Augustine, calls him Papas, Pope, just as even now every priest is called a father. Still just the same. In three manners, or three modes from this name is the primacy of the Bishop of Rome gathered. Firstly, by its use as a proper name, when Papa is absolutely pronounced, he alone is understood. As is clear from the Council of Chalcedon, Acts 16, where we read, quote, "The most blessed and apostolic man, the Pope, commands this of us. Leo is not added, nor Roman, nor the city of Rome, or something else. Secondly, because he alone is called the Pope of the whole Church, as is clear from the same act of the Council of Chalcedon, where Leo is called Pope of the Universal Church. And from Liberatus, where we read that no one is Pope over the Church of the whole world except the Roman Pontiff. Thirdly, from the fact that the Bishop of Rome is called by the whole world in general councils Father or Pope.
Yep.
But he calls no man Pope or Father, rather sons or brothers, as is clear from the Epistle of the Second Council and from the Epistle of the Council of Chalcedon to Leo. Right? So from this ancient testimony, there's only one that is in charge of the whole world, right? As opposed to various other bishops who might have been, like I mentioned, the Patriarch of Alexandria. Bellarmine mentions Augustine. So then you come to the second name, Father of Fathers, and that was given by Pope Damasus, or to Pope Damasus by Stephen, the Archbishop of Carthage. Okay. Then the third is Pontiff of Christians, which is quoted by Eusebius. The fourth is the Supreme Pontiff, which we read in the same epistle of Stephen of Carthage. Right? And Supreme Pontiff is a normative title in theology, Summus Pontifex, which you'll see often, because pontifex can also mean, in the classical pagan Rome, and I think we addressed this in one episode, it just means priest, any priest. And it originates from when they consecrated the Pons Fabricius, which is where a lot of the trade was flowing into the city from the Greek cities down south, back when Rome was mostly a bunch of habitations of brick and mud and not yet acquired its glorious buildings or its empire or anything.
Okay.
So then, he had charge when you want to make a male actor who does something, you have the suffix fex, ficis, in the endings in the declension, and then you have Pons is bridge.
That's
So
bridge.
pontifex means a priest. For the pagan Romans, that was just a word for priest. And then you had the Pontifex Maximus, the high priest, right? And that was actually Republican office in the Roman Republic. And that's what they would do, is they'd have this guy who's basically in charge of the bridge, just like a carnifex is the one who deals with the flesh, as in is an executor. he's the executioner. He kills men. But anyway, so that's just a note on that term. So that's where pontiff comes from. And technically it can mean any bishop. Just recently we had a bishop come celebrate confirmations in our church here. It's called a pontifical mass.
A pontifical mass,
the
right.
traditional Latin rite.
Right.
And not because he's the Pope, because because pontifex can also mean a bishop. But there's only one summus pontifex.
And summus is supreme. Summus is supreme or some of.
It's a tricky word until you're used to Latin. Summum is just an adjective, so it means the highest degree of something, the most, the supreme, the greatest. And that's how it's generally employed, is just depending, so we get the word summit from that. There's another word for summit, culmen, high point, hence culmination. But anyway, so that's one of those titles. So then Supreme Pontiff. The fifth is Prince of Priests. So Bellarmine adds in this quote, we read concerning this in an epistle of Valentinian to Theodosius, that's the Roman emperor, which is contained before the Council of Chalcedon in volume 1 of the Councils. Quote, the most blessed bishop of the city of Rome, to whom the rule of the priesthood all antiquity conferred over all, and also Prosper of Aquitaine, another church father. Rome, on the account of the rule of the priesthood, was made greater in the citadel of religion than in the lap of power. Let's see. But Calvin objects that the third Council of Carthage, it was forbidden that anyone be called Prince of Priests or High Priest. Rather, only Bishop of the First See. So Bellarmine says, I respond that council only established this with respect to the bishops of Africa, among whom there were many equal primates, lest any of them would be called High Priest or Prince of the others. Nor could this provincial council, or the bishops of any other province, oblige the Roman pontiff. Therefore, St. Gregory, Anselm, St. Bernard, and the Sixth General Council itself, notwithstanding that canon, called the Roman bishop Supreme Pontiff. The sixth is the Vicar of Christ,
right,
which St. Bernard uses. It actually, and also the First Council of Lyons. The seventh is head of the church, which the Council of Chalcedon uses. And so then moving on. But Calvin rejects to the term head of the church.
Okay.
That St. Gregory, in a letter to John, the Bishop of Constantinople, says, Peter, the first member of the Holy and Universal Church, Paul, Andrew, James, what else are they than heads of individual peoples? Still, all are members under one head of the church. So there, Gregory condemned John, who wanted to make himself head of the church, and he uses this argument, because neither Peter nor any other apostle was head of the whole church, but only heads of individual churches and members of the universal church. So Bellarmine responds to this from Calvin. That someone is the head of the whole church can be understood in two ways. In one way, that the head should be such that he alone would be the headed prince, and all the rest of the lower would not be heads, but princes only of their office. In the second way, that he indeed should be the head, but general, so that he does not abolish particular lower places and true heads. So this recalls the argument to aristocracy versus monarchy in the beginning. And so that the monarch, truly rules his kingdom, but then he might also have princes who truly rule in their own right, right? They certainly have ownership of the place, rather than what you have in democracy, where you basically people over a public trust, the res publica, and each man's in it to really better himself for the most part, except for exceptional individuals. Your mythical Cincinnatus or people like that. So so therefore you own something at yourself, and so that he's talking about in the second manner. For that reason, universal cases do not take particulars, and that is why in the army, the emperor does not remove particular generals of legions and cohorts. So then anyway, so that these guys, so the Pope can be the head, and then he could have other bishops who have their particular rights in the church as well. They're just not the supreme one. So then, continuing on, the eighth is the foundation. St. Jerome in his epistle to Damasus, concerning the term hypostasis, says, I know that the church was built upon this rock. There he calls Damasus the rock of the church.
Well, there you have that. How do you argue? Some of these seem to me to be, because the arguments are so simple and they're textual, they're taken from the actual historical record or what Bellarmine could find, that and he doesn't expand upon them, that just a one-sentence answer is good enough to suffice, because you said that basically, okay, 2 + 2 = 5, and no, I have it here from the guy that wrote the 2 + 2 formula that 2 + 2 = 4. Folks, I just want you to notice that the argument that is continuing here on the Modern Wrong World Made Right, Calvin Was Wrong, episode number 17, featuring our Latinist, Ryan Grant of MediatrixPress.com, who is the translator of this book. Just notice that the argument proceeds exactly as it was that we described in the first segment of the recap of this entire series. And that is, it is an argument from history. Now, there is a theological argument to be made, but St. Robert Bellarmine is not making that argument right now. What he's doing now is just taking the arguments, the fallacious arguments that have been hurled at the entire history of the Roman Pontiff, and thus at the future of any popes, and he's taking it point by point, case by case, and using the facts that are available, is demolishing the arguments that are put forth. And the one that we just heard, the 8th, is the foundation. Jerome, in his first epistles to Damasus on the term hypostasis, says, I know that the church was built upon this rock. The irony of that is, and I'll just point this out, that's why I interrupted Ryan, is that the solo scripturists get the Bible that they quote from, and that they like to tell, they accuse many Catholics of never having read. That is largely the work of St. Jerome going to the Holy Land and translating the text, the ancient text, from Greek or Hebrew into Latin, and then gathering the other text up and then bringing them back to Rome so they can be compiled. So I just wanted to drop that little historical note in. That's my contribution on this. Ryan?
So then the ninth, excuse me, the ninth is shepherd of the Lord's flock. St. Ambrose says to Pope Siricius, we recognize from the letters of your sanctity the watch of the good shepherd, how you faithfully preserve the door entrusted to you, and that you guard the flock of Christ with pious care. The 10th is ruler of the house of God. Ambrose says in his commentary on 1 Timothy 3, the house of God is the church, whose ruler today is Damasus. The 11th is watchman of the vineyard. The Council of Chalcedon wrote in a letter to Pope Leo, in addition, he extends insanity against him, that is, they're talking about Dioscorus, to whom the care of the vineyard was consigned by the Savior against his apostolic sanctity. And so, again, the Dioscorus at the Council of Chalcedon wanted, said we should depose the Pope. And so the whole council reacted against him, because you can't depose the Pope, and other things. So 12 is the father and doctor of all Christians. We so have it in the Council of Florence. In the last session, by the same reasoning, the Roman Church is called mother and teacher of all Christians, as we have it in the Lateran Council under Innocent III, chapter 5.
Right.
The 13th is spouse of the Church. The Pope is thus called in the Council of Lyons. But some object that St. Bernard warns Pope Eugene, lest he should think himself as the spouse of the Church. Rather, he should consider himself friend of the spouse, and because it would seem absurd that the vicar of the king would be called the bridegroom of the queen. I respond, just as the Pope is called the head, ruler, and shepherd of the Church in place of Christ, so also is he called the spouse in place of Christ, or as vicar and minister of Christ. For Christ is the true and principal spouse. As it is said in John 3, he makes the church fertile by his Spirit, and by his seed alone, which is the Word of God, sons are born. Popes are called spouses because they cooperate extrinsically, that is, on the outside, in the generation of sons, just as of a minister of the Word in the sacraments, and they generate sons not unto themselves, but unto Christ. Bernard, therefore, only intended to admonish the pontiff, lest he would think that he was the principal spouse, and although it would be most absurd in the manner of carnal generation for the king to be assisted by a vicar, and one spouse to be of many, still in the spiritual order it is not absurd.
Right.
So the 14th is...
Prelate.
The 14th is prelate of the Apostolic See. First, it must be observed that not only was Rome called the Apostolic See by the ancients, but also Antioch, Jerusalem, Ephesus, and others, which the apostles founded, and in which they sat just as bishops. That is clear from Tertullian and St. Augustine. But the Roman pontiff excels over these three in regards to name. Firstly, because when it is simply said apostolic see, and the name of Antioch, Ephesus, or Rome is not added, it is always understood as Rome, which is called apostolic through an epithet, right? And so this is also clear in the Fathers.
Okay.
And other things. So then we'll come to the last one. The 15th is universal bishop. And this is one, for example, if you look at the Wikipedia article on primacy, they still have this particular objection that Pope St. Gregory the Great wrote against the term universal bishop. So he'll address that here. So the 15th, hold on a second. Sorry about that. So the 15th is universal bishop. In the Council of Chalcedon, Act 3, 3 epistles of different Greeks to Pope Leo were read, all of which begin thus: to the most holy and blessed and universal bishop and great patriarch, Leo of Rome. From such works, 3 lies of the heretics are refuted. One of Luther, where he said Gregory refused the name of universal, he adds, why would someone speak of the name of supreme and most holy? Therefore, Luther means at the time of Gregory the name of most holy and supreme were as yet unheard of. In that, the incredible inexperience of Luther, or at least his malice, is uncovered, for all the fathers called the Pope of Rome most holy, and the citation clearly shuts his mouth. What of the fact that the second action of the same Council of Chalcedon, Aetius, the bishop of Nicopolis, calls St. Leo our Lord and most holy Pope? By what title more displeases the heretics of our time when, sorry, there's another conversation going on here.
We're almost
when,
done.
nevertheless, what's that?
We're almost finished.
When, nevertheless, it did not displease a universal council and a senate and judge such who listened to Aetius say, because now the epistle of our Lord and most holy Pope has been read, etc. Gregory himself uses the noun supreme, that is sumus again, as we cited above. And the Universal Council of Chalcedon says it, summitas tua, in its epistle to Leo. Then the next objection is of the centuriators, and that's again the Lyricus, who say the Roman pontiff was created a patriarch by Justin the Emperor in the year 700. But if that were so, how comes it that Leo is called universal patriarch very frequently in the Council of Chalcedon, which was celebrated in the year 454?
You know what, Ryan, this is one of the arguments that still is prevalent today amongst our Protestant evangelical friends, that you guys invented that title. It didn't exist until 700. That's where this argument comes from. I always wondered what the source of that was, and now I have it.
Then the next one, the third, is of Calvin. Actually, yeah, because that one's been recycled in Lutheran literature for a while.
Oh, yeah.
Anyway, so the third is of Calvin, who relates the words of St. Gregory, that the title of universal was offered to his predecessors at the Council of Chalcedon. And then he adds, quote, this has no species of truth, that is, no appearance of truth, for such a thing is not seen in the acts of that council, unquote. But of course, this is an impudent lie. Although certainly the council decreed nothing on the matter, still Calvin knows well enough that this name is given to the Roman pontiff, and it did not displease the council, since in the third action, Pope Leo is most often called by this name, and no one in the council condemned such an appeal. But Calvin objects against the name using the words of St. Gregory the Great, and very often repeats that the title of universal bishop is profane and a sacrilege, the forerunner of Antichrist, and therefore no one from his predecessors ever wished it to use it. Even Illyricus objects, and likewise Luther, that in a canon of an African council cited by Gratian, the great medieval canon lawyer, called Prima Sedis, we read, moreover, the Roman pontiff is not called universal, unquote. I respond, the name of universal bishop can be understood in 2 ways. In one way, as he who is called universal should be understood to be the only bishop of all the cities of Christians, so that the rest might not be bishops, but only the vicars of the one who is called universal bishop. And in this manner, the name is truly profane, a sacrilege, and perhaps of Antichrist. Gregory speaks concerning this meaning, based on the reason which he gives. Even in that epistle cited by Calvin, which is to Constance, it is exceedingly sad that it should be patiently borne in regard to all being despised. My brother and fellow bishop, being in charge, only tries to be called a bishop. In a letter to Eulogius, if one is called the universal patriarch, the name of the other patriarchs would be diminished. And in an epistle to Eusebius, if one is universal, what remains is that you would not be bishops. In another manner, a bishop can be called universal who has care of the whole church, but generally not so as to exclude particular bishops. And in another manner, a bishop can be called universal who has care of the whole church, but generally not so as to exclude particular bishops. And in this matter, the name can be given to the Roman pontiff. which is also proven from the mind of St. Gregory. Firstly, because Gregory affirms that the name universal bishop was given to the Roman pontiff by the Council of Chalcedon, as well as to his successors, which the same Gregory, who was holy and Catholic, teaches everywhere. Therefore, he thought in some sense this was fitting for the Roman pontiff. Secondly, because Gregory asserts in the same epistle that care of the whole church was consigned to Peter by the Lord, because it's the same thing as if he would have said, Peter is the universal bishop constituted by Christ.
Right.
Thirdly, because even the Roman pontiffs, as Gregory correctly says, were never called universal bishops. Still, they often called themselves bishops of the universal church, as is clear from many popes. Such testimonies Gregory certainly read, nor was he ignorant in regard to the sense of a bishop of a universal church and a universal bishop. But someone will say, if this name can have a good sense, why does Gregory absolutely pronounce it to be proud and sacrilegious and profane? Why does he absolutely avoid its use? I respond, for two reasons. Firstly, for caution, just as the name Christotokos has a good sense, and still the fathers avoided the use of this name, lest it would seem that the Nestorian heresy lurked underneath it. For Nestorius called Mary the mother of Christ, but not the mother of God. Secondly, because that's what the Greek means, Christotokos, mother of Christ.
Right.
Secondly, because then the question was whether the name could be conceded to John, the Bishop of Constantinople, but not whether it would be conceded to the Roman Pontiff, because then the name universal would in no sense be fitting for that John, and still he usurped it to himself. Therefore, Gregory simply and absolutely pronounced this name to be profane and a sacrilege. Without a doubt, it was given in regard to the Bishop of Constantinople, and just the same, even he refused it, although it was fitting for him in some sense, so as to better and more easily suppress the pride of the Bishop of Constantinople. And from these, the argument of Calvin is answered. To the second of Luther and Illyricus, I say they did not notice those words were not of a council of Africa, but of Gratian, who later relates the canon of this Council of Africa, in which a bishop of the first see was forbidden to be called Prince of Priests. And he adds on his own, nor is the Roman pontiff called universal. Because such words are of Gratian, they do not have authority, and on that account can be understood in the manner which the words of St. Gregory are. It is a worthy observation to make in this place, such was and is even in this time the pertinacity and pride of the Greeks. So I have to apologize to your EO listeners because Bellarmine doesn't much care for their position. So the pertinacity and pride of the Greeks, as well as how severely they were punished by God. For when the see of the Bishop of Constantinople, which for more than 300 years had no place among the primary sees, not only elevated itself to the patriarchate, but even ahead of the sees of Alexander and Antioch, and wanted to make itself equal to Rome as well as universal, it could not be reduced to sanity by the censure of Pelagius II and of other popes. More often, for this reason, they were excommunicated, as Leo IX writes in his epistle to the emperor, nor even by the humility of St. Gregory, who, as John the Deacon writes in his life, that he began on account of this affair to write not that he was an archbishop or a patriarch, but a bishop and servant of the servants of God, servus servorum Dei, which the popes still use today, by the way. Even an edict from the Emperor Phocas, about which we spoke about above, could accomplish this purpose. At length, by a judgment of God from heaven, the Greeks were handed over with their universal patriarch into the hands of the Turks, which St. Brigitta had foretold was going to happen to them, as well as Pope Nicholas V and Gennadius Scholarius relate in the book on behalf of the Council of Florence. And so that's how the book 2 ends. Now, interestingly, on the Greek side, on the EO side, they claim that having accepted union at the Council of Florence is the thing that God punished them for. Right. So, right. So that they have their side of that story as well. But nevertheless, so that's how, Bellarmine stops to, again, attack the Orthodox.
I want to get I want to clarify something just for the benefit of those that may have been listening, because there were two conversations that were going on for a little while there, so it might be a little bit confusing. The final argument that was made is that the term universal is used by some to describe the Pope, early popes, and that some popes then proclaim themselves as not being, or tell others, write to others, sometimes in council, sometimes in letters, that they aren't universal. And this is seized upon of see, he said he's not universal. And if I understood correctly, and what logic is telling me, is that the term universal can mean, what Bellarmine was explaining can mean two separate things. It could mean universal in that he would be a universal, a head over one entity that is universal, or it could mean universal as in when he's denying that he is not the only bishop, and therefore is not universal, and doesn't pretend to be universal. But maybe you can clarify it as well, because I have to say, of all the arguments we heard, that one is taking the most amount of time to digest.
It's a little bit tricky, but essentially it's, so he says there's two senses in which it can be profane. So one is the idea that the Pope is the only bishop, period.
Right.
Everyone else is subservient to him and has no power or authority or anything else. And the other is that simply he is in charge of all the other ones. And that's the difference, essentially. So he's, so quotes, the ancient fathers who use this term, and that the Roman Pontiff was given this title by the Council of Chalcedon, and Gregory himself asserts that. So, but essentially, the only reason that St. Gregory the Great attacked this particular title was because to restrain the pride of the Greek Patriarchate in Constantinople, which was appealing to this term and doing their utmost to be universal bishop because it was a royal city. And he had to, take it down a peg. So that's essentially why he opposes that. Let me make Whereas you don't get that background information. Instead, you get, like I said, if you go to the Wikipedia page on papal primacy, you just get, Gregory wrote against it, but you don't get any of this other particular detail.
Well, let me make a real world analogy here. Roger Goodell is the universal head of the NFL. Of all the teams, of all the league, when he is representing the NFL and all of the other heads. He is not the universal head of all of the NFL. How about that, Ryan?
If I watch football, it might resonate with me, but I don't. So hopefully that works for your listeners.
Well, what I mean is, you wouldn't have to watch football, but he's the commissioner. So when someone needs to speak on behalf of all the teams of the NFL, ex cathedra from his office, he is the commissioner of the NFL, and he can speak as the universal head of the NFL. He cannot speak as the universal head of the New Orleans Saints. How about that?
Yeah, that makes complete sense.
So that's so you could use the term universal. He is universally over Tom Benson and the Saints, but he's not the universal boss of all the Tom Benson and the New Orleans Saints or the New York Giants or whatever we do. Hey, folks, that's going to wrap up this segment. We went over time, but we finished it with a great recap, and we now will look forward to next week when we begin phase 2 of this project, or the next episode, where we begin phase 2 and we get into the volume 3 of this work, which is on the Antichrist. And that will principally deal, as Ryan kind of previewed it for us, with principally deal with the accusations of John Calvin that St. Robert Bellarmine answers. We've heard a few in Calvin Was Wrong, but we'll get into volume 2 now, or let's see here, season 2 of Calvin Was Wrong, episode 1. Then season 2 of Calvin Was Wrong, episode 1 will begin in 2 weeks from today, right here on the Crusade Channel. Remember, if you want to read these books in their entirety, you can find them in the Founders Trading Post at my website at mikechurch.com. If you missed any of the previous 16 episodes, you can get all of them. You can download them if you're a Founders Pass member, and you can become a Founders Pass member by going to veritasradionetwork.com/join. And you can subscribe for as little as 23 cents per day by the month or by the year. And if you sign up for a yearly membership and you're hearing this in June 2016, go to the website at veritasradionetwork.com, and we will be happy to, as a free gift for your yearly membership, to send you a copy of the book that I edited, Life of Washington, Volume 1, best bio of George Washington ever written by Washington Irving. He of Sleepy Hollow fame. It's a beautiful hardback. It's from the first U.S. printing. You can't find this book anywhere else, and you're not going to find it. Free of charge. Don't cost nothing for your yearly membership. To sign up, go to VeritasRadioNetwork.com/join or call 866-483-3833.